It is truly wonderful to be here with you today. Even though we are at a distance, I feel so much closer now. One of the great joys over the last few weeks for me has been to work with a number of youth who are exploring faith and talking about the possibility of baptism. As we have been reading the Bible together, we keep coming back to a few key questions. Who is God? How do the stories in the Bible relate to the bigger picture of the Bible? Putting it in perspective, both the context of the particular passage and also how things fit into the larger narrative arc of the biblical text. And why does this text matter? What does it mean for us here today? As I read today's texts, I kept coming back to these questions as they shaped my reflections on the Gospel of Matthew. Who is God? What's the story? And why does it matter? We start at the beginning. Now, when Jesus heard this, what is the this that is being referred to here? This story follows Jesus' cousin John, known to us as John the Baptist, being killed by Herod, and John's head being brought in on a platter. The news Jesus hears just before our story today is that his cousin, the man who jumped in the womb when he heard of Jesus, the man who foretold Jesus' coming and then went on to baptize Jesus, has just been brutally killed. No wonder Jesus wants to go away to a deserted place on his own. Imagine his grief and fear. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. The crowd's response when they hear this tragic news is to flock to where Jesus is, even if it means going out into a deserted place. One author pondered this. I wonder if the point is that Herod's act of killing John was just the final straw for some of these folks. Herod is too big to overthrow, too cruel to endure. What is left? Verse 14. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. This pandemic has taught me many things about myself, and one thing that it has confirmed, as I was living in a house with 4 other people, is that I need my alone time. When I'm hurting, grieving, needing space, the last thing that I would want would be a huge crowd clamoring for my attention. Yet, Jesus responds to the crowd with compassion. Not only is it a huge crowd, they also bring their sick. And Jesus takes the time to heal them. Jesus does not offer pity from a distance, but meets them in their gut-wrenching pain, because he is also holding his own pain. Verse 15. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go to the villages and buy food for themselves. I have a love-hate relationship with the disciples. I'm a very practical person. I like doing the logical thing. I would have been the first one in line telling Jesus what to do. It made sense. It was getting late. They were in a remote location. A crowd of hungry and tired people doesn't sound appealing. They were asking Jesus to send them off to take care of themselves. The disciples are trying to shift the responsibility for the hurting, hungry crowd away from themselves. But Jesus responds with one of the key phrases in this story. Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." Ooh, really, Jesus? I feel like we miss something here by not being able to hear the tone and the quality of Jesus' voice. This is an important spot to step back into the wider story to get some perspective on what is going on. Warren Carter writes, "The first century Roman Empire was marked by significant inequalities concerning food access. Many people knew food insecurity and struggled on a daily and seasonal basis for adequate food and nutrition. Not only were people hungry that day, it was part of a larger problem. A problem that the disciples wanted to get Jesus away from. Add on to this wealth inequality the location they were in. Where were they going to send over 5,000 people to get a quick evening meal? I get flashbacks to stopping at rest stops with a busload of youth. As we enter the restaurant, the McDonald's staff faces blanching when we tell 60 young people that they have 20 minutes for all of them to get food and get back on the bus. It would have been impossible to feed 5,000, and that's just counting the men, not the women and the children. Yet, it's as if God steps up and says, "Challenge accepted." Here we hear intentional echoes of other biblical texts. God does not abandon the people of Israel in the desert, but feeds them manna, a food that no one had heard of before. This is a God that makes a jar of oil and a bit of flour last through a famine, and sends birds to feed others in the wilderness. We hear the disciples' meager reply. "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." In these words were the disciples confessing that they don't even have enough to feed themselves and Jesus. I wonder how many times we hold out our hands to God and say, "I can't help. I can't do it. All I have is this tiny thing. It's not enough." And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Jesus invites them to bring what they have. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked to heaven, blessed, and broke the loaves. Here again, we see the biblical text being in conversation with itself. Earlier in the text, we are drawn to memories from the past. And now we see a foreshadowing of the Last Supper that is to come. Jesus takes bread, blesses it, and breaks it. We hear whispers of, "My body broken for you." Verse 19 ends with, Jesus blessed and broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Jesus puts the food, the work, the opportunity to be part of this kingdom action back into the hands of the disciples. As if Jesus is saying, "Here, let me show you how." This food that had been brought to Jesus in their scarcity mindset, Jesus hands back to them as abundance. It is the gift that they now share. With Jesus' blessing, the disciples become part of the enactment of the miracle. Verse 20, and all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of broken pieces, 12 baskets full. If we hadn't fully gotten the picture of the abundance of God, just look at these leftovers. That would be about 12 refrigerators full to overflowing. You know when you can't get the door closed because there's too much in there? Humor aside, let's just review. We started with 5 loaves and 2 fish. I'm not that good at math, but this is amazing. We arrive here at the end of the story, and we ask the question, what does it matter? What does this mean for us? This is the only miracle story that is shared by all 4 Gospels. There was something so important here for the early church that every gospel wanted to repeat it. And maybe it's because there is so much here, like the 12 baskets of overflowing leftovers. I know that I often feel like the disciples, that I have little to give a hungry and hurting world. Yet what I name as nothing, Jesus blesses and returns as abundance. This is an invitation to bring what you have and join in. We are joining with a God of abundant provision. You are welcome to this space of being fed. This welcome is not only for you, because the real wonder of this story is that it continues. God still cares deeply and passionately for those who are most vulnerable, the poor, the immigrant, the hungry. And God continues to use us to care for them. This is not just a wilderness potluck. God does not act in the ways that we do. God can feed so many with so little. And God sees potential when we see nothing. In the face of the violence and the power plays of this world, amidst the inequalities of wealth, we are not rallied to fight, but to feed and be fed. Jesus knew pain, grief, and the rage of injustice being enacted upon those that he was close to. Yet he chose to respond in a gut-wrenching compassion, healing, teaching, modeling a new way, and feeding. As we sing this next song, I invite you to connect with your deep hunger, those places that feel scarce or filled with longing. Bring Jesus into that space with you. May you be filled and satisfied like eating a fresh loaf of bread. May you be refreshed by cool waters in these hot days. And may you be renewed for the feeding of others. Amen.